Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. What happens when you feel like you have a well-developed auxiliary or Copilot function?
Wow, what does that even mean?
What does that even mean? Well, here at Personality Hacker, we talk a lot about the cognitive function stack for your Myers-Briggs type.
Yeah.
And we like to think of it as a car model. And so probably our number one message that we say over and over and over again is focus on developing that Copilot process. So if you're curious what the Copilot process is for your personality type, go to personalityhacker.com, look up your personality type. There'll be podcasts, articles, there'll be resources that help you find out what your car model is, like the passengers in your car, or what is technically called your cognitive function stack.
Yeah, and if you don't know your personality type, we also have a test on the site as well.
Right, exactly. But for those of you who know your personality type and know your car model passengers or your cognitive function stack, and you have heard us say repeatedly, develop the Copilot, which is effectively us saying develop that auxiliary cognitive function. And you hear us saying this over and over again, and your response is, yeah, but I have developed that. I have context in my life, or I have situations that have forced me to develop it, or maybe I'm just been massively into personal development, and I recognize the need to do that once I learned about the stack, and or I just happen to recognize, maybe even in an unconscious way, not knowing that this was my Copilot or auxiliary process, or these were activities that activated and exercised it. I just intuitively knew that that was something I was supposed to do, and here I am. And now I have a very well-developed auxiliary process. So what have you got for me? Like, if I have a very well-developed Copilot process, now what do I do?
So type theory indicates that in our cognitive function stack, we have those 4 cognitive functions that stack in our car model, and it indicates that you develop those in order over your lifetime. So when you're young, but just by default, you're going to develop your dominant or your driver cognitive function process. And as you get older, your teen years, your 20s, maybe your 30s, you're going to develop that Copilot process, or what is technically called the auxiliary. And then, maybe midlife, 40s, 50s, 60s even, you start to develop that tertiary, or what we call the 10-year-old process in the car model, and then onward from there into that inferior 3-year-old process. So that's basic type theory, talks about the order of developing those. Now, what actually happens, just as a quick note here, is because your 10-year-old and your dominant or driver process in that car model are the same attitude, meaning they're either outwardly focused or inwardly focused, extroverted or introverted. It can be it's very common, I should say, to skip past the development of that secondary process and go straight to the tertiary, not necessarily in a development way, but in a over-reliance or in a defensive way. And what we're saying is that you focus first on that Copilot or auxiliary and really develop that. That's the highest leverage point for growth in your personality. And what comes next, according to type theory, would be that tertiary process, that 10-year-old process in the car model. The very thing that we've told you all along up till now, stay away from right now, don't develop that yet. Get your Copilot developed first. Get that auxiliary process developed first. And then we can talk about the tertiary 10-year-old. And that's really what we would go to next. Once your Copilot or auxiliary process is developed, you would then open up the possibility to go to that 10-year-old process and put actual effort there, not using it as something you over-rely upon or go to when you're defensive, but focus on using it well and in support of your primary and secondary functions, your driver and your Copilot functions. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, well, and I do want to give a couple asterisks, things of note, footnotes, if you will, on a couple things to be aware of when we talk about type dynamics. First, if you believe that your auxiliary or Copilot process is extremely well developed, like every time we say that, you just do not resonate with us at all, and you have never had a context that has pushed you to go there, or you've never done like active personal development work in this, then that Copilot process may actually be your dominant. I have seen this happen over and over. the difference between the two is which dichotomy of introversion or extroversion you're leading with. That's what diagnoses whether or not your cognitive functions are your dominant and auxiliary or in reverse. And there are, I would say in particular, extroverts that don't really identify with the label of extroversion, in particular because they don't identify with being the life of the party, or they have an extroverted process that isn't particularly social. Maybe, I don't know, like a TJ, where their dominant process is extroverted thinking, and they're not particularly social, and they need plenty of alone time because when they engage with people, they're not getting anything done. And extroverted thinking, or what we call effectiveness, requires things to get done. And so too much socializing almost feels like, unless you're like leveraging the socializing for a business opportunity or for something to that effect, too much socializing can feel like you're not getting anything accomplished. And so you'll need to retreat back to going into a space where you're handling whatever's on your to-do list. So there are quite a few TJs, ETJs, who actually identify as introverts. Well, and then they'll hear us talk about, develop your Copilot process. And as ITJs, they have misdiagnosed themselves as having extroverted thinking or effectiveness as that secondary or Copilot process. And then they don't resonate with what we say. And it's because that's actually their dominant process. So that will happen sometimes. And there's all different flavors of this. I've seen this happen with ENFPs and INFPs. And I've seen this happen all sorts of types. But the point is, the asterisk I want to mention before we launch into assuming that you have a very well-developed auxiliary process is to make sure that you haven't possibly misdiagnosed yourself as an introvert when you're actually an extrovert, or vice versa. Some introverts misdiagnose themselves as extroverts because they are quite social, because they do enjoy socializing with people and don't necessarily have it drain them as much as maybe some other introverted types. So just ensure that you've got that introvert-extrovert dichotomy label accurate and that you're really looking at the heart of what that means. And one of the ways you can do that is we just did a podcast on becoming a better profiler or better at typing other people. Go check that out. We talk about the actual difference between introvert and extrovert. If you have any confusion on it, go check out that podcast, and that will help you do a better diagnostic on yourself. All right, so that was the first asterisk I wanted to make. The second,
But wait, there's more.
The second asterisk I want to make is make sure when you have self-diagnosed as somebody who has a very strong auxiliary process or Copilot process, make sure you're not throwing in a hint of bias in there. We all want to see ourselves as very highly developed. And there are extraordinary things that your auxiliary process can do that you may not have tapped into yet. And remember, there's a difference between use and exercising. So the difference between the two is, say you have a stick with a little pad at the bottom of the stick, and you have a 3-inch ball, and you're hitting the 3-inch ball with this stick, and you see that it goes really, really far away when you're doing that. Well, the second you put a 2-inch ball and you put a 3-inch hole at the end of who knows how many yards, 200 yards, and your goal is to get that little ball into that little hole at the end of the range, now you're not just using this golf club and the golf ball. Now you're not just using it by hitting the little ball with a stick. Now you actually have a goal in front of you, and now you're exercising the entire process, like you're getting better at it. So when we talk about a well-developed Copilot process, we're not talking about somebody who simply uses their Copilot a lot. We're talking about somebody who has exercised it, that's gotten to a level of proficiency where they can do possibly even extraordinary tasks with this process. So make sure you're coming at it from a perspective of modesty as we walk through this, because most people actually don't have their Copilot or auxiliary process as well developed as they'd like to think they do. And that includes myself for many, many years. So just come from a place of modesty and make sure that you have diagnosed your introvert or extrovert dichotomy accurately.
Yeah, it would also be very similar to a non-dominant hand in your body, right? So if you're right-handed, dominant right-handed, your Copilot or auxiliary hand would be your left hand. You use it every day, most likely. But are you proficient at it? I mean, can you write with your non-dominant hand? Can you do fine motor skills with it? Can you throw even a ball with it? You can, but it'll be clumsy as you throw it. So it's much different. And, I've actually gotten to an ambidextrous way. I eat with my left hand now, weirdly enough. So I've actually developed the use of my left hand more than I had when I was younger, because I've trained myself to do so. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about training that cognitive process in order to develop it, not just use it. You are going to use it by default, but we're talking about putting attention to it, exercising it, using it in a fine motor skill way, if you will.
Yeah. I would also say that Copilot or auxiliary process, when you do start putting time and attention toward it and developing it well, that's when all the ways in which you haven't developed it become very obvious to you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like you start to shine. We use this phrase a lot. This is also, we talked about a drinking game in a previous podcast that every time we say holding space, you take a shot. I think another shot or a phrase that could be another shot is shine a light in dark spaces. I think that's another component to that drinking game.
I love how we're going to just develop an entire audience of alcoholics.
Yeah. Listening to our podcast. So once you start to put time and attention to really truly developing that auxiliary process, you do shine a light in dark spaces. And I'll say that as an ENTP, when I finally truly started focusing on developing introverted thinking, like really developing it, I recognized just how married to, like just really married to relatively unprovable beliefs I was. Things that once I adopted the premise, afterwards I could just argue with anybody and out-argue them and give all sorts of reasons why my belief system or the things, my paradigm, the things I was believing made complete and total sense. And I wasn't really as rigorous with my with the premises as I was with all the subsequent arguments that got built on those premises. Once I recognized just how much I believed everything I thought, that was when I really recognized how much work I had to do with the introverted thinking process. And now I'm at a place where it becomes super clear to me, probably because I had so many people who used introverted thinking as a dominant process become my mentors. I recognize that it's actually not the answers you have, it's the quality of your questions that really shows up and is the most, I would say, accurate predictor of a well-developed introverted thinking process. And I had been using that process like crazy my entire life, but I didn't really understand what it was all about until I started putting time and attention towards it.
Yeah, and I would also say that it's a very for me as an ENFP developing my Copilot of introverted feeling, FI, or we call it authenticity, because I'd relied upon a thinking process at my 10-year-old. I tended to ignore anytime strong emotions would come up or difficult emotions. And so when I started to work on that, it was very destabilizing for myself and the people around me because I'm all of a sudden in a very emotional space when people aren't used to me being there. I show up and maybe I'm having a little bit of outbursts or I'm crying at the drop of a hat. Or to me, I mean, I literally lost sense of some motor skills as I was developing this, weirdly enough. Because I'm in my emotions, I'm not thinking logically about my next steps. I'll bump glasses of water over or I'll run into walls. I mean, this happened to me. It was very destabilizing for about 3 years. And as I started to gain more and more traction in developing this, things started to stabilize. And I would say at this point now, years later, after this journey, going through this process, I would say that you start to gain a sense of mastery over this. And you wonder where it had been your whole life because you knew you had it. But when you begin to develop it, you gain a sense of mastery to go, wow, I wish I had developed this so much sooner and had this available to me moving through life. This is so amazing. And I resisted it. I hated it. It was destabilizing. And now I'm so grateful I went through that work. And now I would say, I think I'm ready to move on to the next cognitive function in my stack and develop that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. And what I think ends up happening when you have put time and intention, I said attention, but really I mean intention towards developing that auxiliary process. And once you really get that up to a level of mastery. Now it's never going to get to the level of mastery as your dominant process, but it can get darn close. You now have access to this tool, the 10-year-old or tertiary process. You have access to it in a completely different way than maybe you accessed it before.
Yeah.
Like before, you may have accessed it in, say, what's called the loop, right? Your dominant process and your tertiary, your driver, we call it your driver and 10-year-old, they get in cahoots with each other, and then they get this loop going. And that's never a healthy thing to do because it allows you to stay in whichever world. You mentioned the word attitude before, either the introverted or the extroverted world that is your comfort zone. So it allows you to stay in your comfort zone, and that's not very good or healthy for any sort of growth.
It's like a codependent relationship with your cognitive functions.
Yeah, exactly. So you may have accessed it before in that way, and you may have also accessed it here and there in healthy ways, like depending upon how healthy you were as an individual at the time. But once you really develop that Copilot or auxiliary process, now your 10-year-old process, or what's called your tertiary, now becomes available to you in a whole new way. And you start accessing it with a different relationship. And I've noticed that just like when you go to your auxiliary process and there's some bumping around, there's some like basically playing bumper cars with that process in the world, and you're kind of clumsy and you feel like you should be better at this, but you're not, and it's painful, and you have to go through this whole huge learning curve of what it can actually give you. I find that process starts all over again with the tertiary process. Like that process goes all over again with that 10-year-old function, is that now you've got this tool available to you and you might maybe even overutilize it, or you feel like you have higher proficiency than you actually do. And then there's a couple missteps. So it's not so much that you go back to the drawing board, but it can almost feel regressive when you start developing it. Just like when you're really developing your Copilot or auxiliary process, that felt a little regressive. Going back to your 10-year-old or tertiary can sometimes feel a little regressive as well, because it's like you were an amazing, golf player before, but now you've taken up racquetball, and now you have to learn this whole new tool completely differently. And maybe some of the skills you built with golf can translate, and maybe some of them can't. And so you now go back to a place where you really recognize that you've got some more growth and development to do.
Now, both you and I grew up in contexts that we had to rely upon our 10-year-old a lot. My 10-year-old of effectiveness, extroverted thinking, your 10-year-old, Antonia, of extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony. We grew up in context. I grew up my parents ran a organization, a nonprofit youth organization. So I use this process all the time to get things done, accomplish things. I ran events. I was an administrator in a lot of ways. I ran their finances for a time. I was in a leadership position. And so I pulled upon this process a lot, and I suppressed my true, authentic feelings or desires based on utilizing this process to help me get things done a lot. And I think you, in your context, you speak to that, but I think you relied on yours as well a lot. And I've noticed that now that I've developed my Copilot, now I've developed my auxiliary process, I'm going back to that tertiary or 10-year-old. And it's a great process that I've had a lot of use around, and now applying it to business, running Personality Hacker. We pull on our tertiary 10-year-olds a lot for this. Like, there's a lot of things that have to be done, logistics, paperwork, things that have to be led, events, all these kind of things. And I use it now, and I think at this point, because I've had so much use before, it's not as destabilizing as my Copilot was in development, but it certainly is something that I have to recalibrate around. In other words, there's old templates or patterns I used to pull on. Let's say I'm running a live event for Personality Hacker. Back in my younger days when I'm running youth events, you have to be extremely high energy. You've got to generate a ton of energy to match teenagers and young people. And so at an event now, I might utilize that same template of generating a lot of energy. And here I'm in a room full of maybe a lot of INJs, introverted people, maybe highly sensitive people, and my energy is just blasting outward because that's something I relied upon growing up. And I have to calibrate that tertiary process now. The templates and the things, the systems and all the processes I had developed around that. Now, this is unique to this function. Systems and processes and all that, whatever your tertiary is, listening will be different, but this is mine. I rely on those and I'm like, wait, this isn't working exactly how it used to work because I have to recalibrate to how I'm using my secondary now. It has to be in service. My tertiary 10-year-old has to be in service of my Copilot or auxiliary. I've got to make sure I'm in alignment with that. My values are in alignment. I feel authentic in this action, and then I can pull upon that 10-year-old or tertiary.
Yeah, I find that one of the biggest missteps that I'm doing in developing my 10-year-old process of extroverted feeling is that I am underestimating how much energy it takes from me. Because, I used to use it in sort of like these little truncated situations. But I allowed myself to go, like you mentioned that I when I was growing up, I was in a context that required a lot of extroverted feeling from me. And what I found myself doing a lot of times before is just being quiet because I knew I was going to say something to offend somebody. And so I would oftentimes just be quiet and then do whatever I knew that they wanted me to do. But that's not a very healthy expression of extroverted feeling. In fact, those of you, if you're developing it as a secondary process or a Copilot auxiliary, you know that we oftentimes say, no, use it for boundary setting and for conflict resolution, not conflict avoidance. So now that I'm going back to my 10-year-old or tertiary process of extroverted feeling, I'm learning to do it with boundary setting, and I'm learning to do it by conflict resolution, not conflict avoidance. So I'm still taking the actions that my Copilot or auxiliary process of introverted thinking believes is right for me. So I am using it in service of that Copilot process, but I now have to, because I'm using it in service of the Copilot, I now have to form a different relationship with it. And in time periods before where I would just let things slide or I wouldn't get my needs met, I would just allow myself to maybe give because I wanted to be liked or I didn't want people to disapprove of me. Now I'm having to form a relationship with it that says, no, I'm going to go ahead and take the hit of disapproval if I need to. And I'm going to do the thing that I need to do. But one of the missteps I'm taking is that I believe I have so much more energy for emotional space holding, right? Like holding space, take a shot. Emotional space holding, I don't actually have as much energy for that as I would have believed I did. And so I'm noticing myself having to recalibrate to just how much energy that process takes from me. And I don't think I'm ever going to get to a space or a place where I can indefinitely throw energy at, like making sure everybody in the room feels good and making sure that I'm, dealing with another person's like emotional upsetness or whatever. Like, I don't think I have an infinite amounts of energy for that. Whereas when I was working on my Copilot process, what I noticed is that I actually had more energy for that than I thought I was going to. I actually had plenty of energy for that because I could see the returns so clearly and I was in my zone and it was complementing my driver process so well that I actually underestimated how much I could give to my Copilot, but I'm noticing I'm overestimating how much I can give to my 10-year-old. So I have to be really careful when I'm using my 10-year-old and wielding it and developing it, not to throw too much energy at it because it can suck me dry, really. And when I feel like, as I'm developing this tool, when I feel like, I think I'm giving too much to it, and I think I need to get back in my strengths to recoup some of that energy, that's something that has become a new phenomenon for me. But I am noticing that now that I'm in that tertiary 10-year-old process, really developing it, I am noticing that my relationship with it is quite different. And my relationship with it is definitely in service to my strengths. And that was not how I used it before. And I think what ends up happening now is I end up finding myself in much better rapport with other people, with a lot more capacity for compassion, because my 10-year-old's extroverted feeling, but it also means that I can't give too much to other people. And I've got to see when that cutoff time comes. And I've got to go, okay, well, I'm out. I'm done. Right. And I just can't be here anymore. I noticed it really come up for me when we were recording the live event, or we were doing the live event in Pittsburgh recently that you kind of referenced for the Personality Hacker Profiler Training live event. I was going to get on stage to teach. So I needed to be fully in my introverted thinking process. Like when I'm teaching, that is my go-to tool. And I needed to be fully there. And there was a bit of a disagreement or a bit of a conflict that got raised with some of our team members that just needed a little bit of management. And beforehand, I think in times past, I would have dropped everything and gone to help create some, back to get everybody into simpatico. But I found myself so frustrated because I could feel extroverted feeling. I could just experience it pulling the energy from my introverted thinking, which I needed to teach. And I was just about to go on stage. And so I just went, nope, I'm not dealing with that. I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm just assuming everybody's an adult and can figure it out themselves. And of course they did. Everything was fine. But I think in times past, I would have somehow felt some sort of obligation to go do that. And now I find myself in a much healthier space where it's like, nope, I have a need to be fully in my strengths, to go teach on stage for many hours out of this day. So I'm just going to abandon that tool. And I think that's really the point, is that when you really have your Copilot or auxiliary process well developed, you will find that you are not getting jerked around by your 10-year-old or your tertiary. You have a much easier time of looking at it and going, you're not the right tool for the job right now, so I'm simply not going to go to you. I'm going to recoup everything from my strengths because that's where I need to be right now.
How I look at it, in the past, before I developed my Copilot, a challenge would come or decision had to be made, I would automatically kick it over to my tertiary or 10-year-old and to be like, here, handle this. And now I think what I do is I stop for a moment. I send it over to my auxiliary. It's kind of weird to talk about your cognitive functions this way, but I send the decision point over to my auxiliary, and my auxiliary will sometimes call upon my 10-year-old, say, hey, you want to come help me with this? Take a look at this thing. What do you think about this decision? I mean, this is all happening unconsciously in my brain, but this is basically what's going on, is how I see it. And my tertiary gets called upon. It doesn't get just tossed things onto its lap. It's not like it's just going about its day and here, handle this, here, handle this, here, handle this. I say, hey, would you come and check in with this decision I have to make? There's a thing that I need some extroverted thinking about. Would you kind of take a look at this? And my tertiary is developed enough that it can do that. It doesn't want the full responsibility. It's just a 10-year-old, right? It's a child almost in my personality. It doesn't want me just to toss the entire project on its lap, but it can help with some tasks, and it can help take a look at the project and say, well, you might want to think about this timeline here, because I'm really good as your Joel effectiveness process in doing timelines, and that's not going to be enough time for this project or whatever. So I think that's probably what I would offer as my support here. And I go, oh, cool, thank you. And I can use that process now almost like a consultant, if you will. I'm not giving it responsibility. I'm calling upon it to help me. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about here with your tertiary as well, your extroverted feeling, is that you don't find yourself just tossing things over to it. You will call upon it, and in that moment during the event, it was a terrible time to be utilizing that, and instantly your gut was like, well, I'll just wait a minute, I'm not going to toss this over. I'm going to hold on to this right now. I'm going to put it back to the team members that need this. Maybe afterward my 10-year-old can help with this, but right now I need to protect my Copilot because that's what I'm going to teach from. That's where I show up as my best self. So I'm going to protect that part of me, and I'm not going to just toss this project or this issue to my 10-year-old. It's not going to go well if I do that, and I know that from experience. And I think that's what is happening when you develop that Copilot. It doesn't matter what your personality is. You will have a tendency, if you don't have that Copilot developed, to toss things to it, but call upon it instead. And that only comes from developing the Copilot first, because that's the only way you're going to be able to call upon it, because you got to go there first to check in and then go down to the tertiary to bring that up.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important to remember as we talk about the CAR model is that we call the tertiary the 10-year-old and the inferior the 3-year-old as a metaphor. That doesn't mean that for you as an individual that your tertiary process is literally the age of 10 or your inferior process is literally the age of 3. Like, as we develop our tertiary processes, I actually see my tertiary start to develop and grow in sophistication. I think it's probably at this point a little beyond the age of 10. I still feel like my inferior process is around 3 years old. That one I'm not. I mean, I can feel myself kind of dipping into it a little bit. Very interestingly, I have a much more healthy, like at peace relationship with it. But I know that I'm not quite there with developing it. And I think I'm keeping myself from trying to rush there. I've learned in personal development that I have a tendency to want to rush into everything and master things as fast as possible. And what I've learned over the last 6 years of really getting massively into growth is I don't want to rush anything. I want to take all the lessons from each stage that I can. And that's why I'm saying if you are a person who believes your Copilot or auxiliary process is well developed, don't rush that. Like, make sure that you're really, truly there. And once you're really, truly there, then start to develop that 10-year-old or tertiary process. And don't rush that either. Don't feel like you have to race through that. There's no like trophy at the end of it. If you pick up all the lessons from each of these functions and what they can do for you in your stack, that's actually where the trophy is. The trophy is that you are healthier and live a better life. So my observation has been that the more you put intention around each of these functions and develop them in as healthy a way as possible, you don't need to rush the process. But once that happens, they do start to grow in age. Their maturity or maturation level starts to raise. So when you think of us talking about the 10-year-old process as being literally 10 years old, your results may vary. They might be different for you. Your tertiary process might be a different age than literally 10 years old. And your inferior process might be a different age than literally 3 years old, depending upon who you are. But that said, they're just metaphors. They're kind of gauges to help you understand the approximate development that most people experience in the CAR model.
So what does it look like, in wrapping up here, coming to land the plane, if you will, what does it look like to develop that 10-year-old tertiary process? And again, as a caveat, you're going to work through your auxiliary or copilot, because remember that loop we talked about with the dominant or driver and that 10-year-old or tertiary is very easy to fall into. It's almost like a codependency loop between your internal cognitive functions. And by developing your copilot or auxiliary process, you're breaking that loop. You're forcing yourself outside of your normal patterns of operating into a much healthier place, and you're forcing yourself to start to grow. And then you need to begin growing that 10-year-old or tertiary, but you don't want to do that again back at that loop. You want to go through the copilot. So what my recommendation is in growth here is to first check in with the copilot. Any decision or something to see, you check in with the copilot, and then your copilot can then request assistance from the 10-year-old or tertiary, not necessarily your dominant like you're used to doing. Go to the copilot first and let that reach out to your 10-year-old or tertiary process for help, support, consultation, whatever that is. And what does that look like in practicality, right? Practicality, let's say I am interacting with people. We're going to a personality hacker meetup, let's say. Let's say we plan something in a city, and I'll just use my personality type, ENFP, in my normal patterning here as an example for you, and this will apply to your type in whatever your cognitive function stack is or CAR model is. We go to, let's say we plan a meetup in Los Angeles, which I'd love to do soon. We go to LA. We have a room picked out for our meetup group, and we walk into the meetup, and there's a lot of people there. It'd be very easy for me to obviously use my dominant process of extroverted intuition. I scan the room. I pattern recognize who's a part of our meetup group, who we should be meeting, who we should be saying hi to. And instantly, it'd be very easy for me to then kick that over to my tertiary 10-year-old process of extroverted thinking and start making a plan, start planning a sequence. Okay, there's about 12 people here. I'll maybe work myself left to right, and I'll meet each person left to right, and I'll create a sequence or a plan. And that probably would work in that scenario. But what I would see for myself now in that scenario is I'd first of all walk in, and I'd get really grounded to myself. So I'd access my introverted feeling part. I'd get very present, very centered. I'd slow everything down. Before I make a plan, I'd get very anchored to who I am, what I'm about, where I'm at in the world, and where I'm at in my personal growth, and get present to my energies in the moment. And the reason I do that is because if I kick it over my tertiary process of extroverted thinking or effectiveness, and I start doing that plan I talked about, I might not be present with people. I might not actually be genuine or authentic with them. I might just be doing the actions of meeting them, working down a line of saying, hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? Walking down that line. But I want to be present with people in that moment. I don't want to just fall back on a pattern that I know will work and get the job done, quote unquote. I actually want to connect with other humans that came to a personality hacker meetup. And so by getting present and anchoring myself into my auxiliary process of introverted feeling, knowing why I'm there, it's to connect with people, not just to get something quote unquote done or accomplish something off of a to-do list. I can then say, okay, I know why I'm here. I'm anchored to the emotions. I'm anchored to the energy. Now, what can I do as far as a plan now that I'm anchored, now that I'm present? How can I go about engaging with people? And I may not do it in a linear fashion that my tertiary was going to suggest to me. I might do it a little more haphazard. I notice there's a cluster of 3 people over here. They look like they're entertaining themselves. So I might not walk up to them at first. And that was where I was originally going to go first when my tertiary was telling me, work from left to right in a sequence. That was my old pattern I would have fallen on. Maybe I'll walk over to that one guy over in the corner sitting by himself who looks like maybe no one's talked to him yet. And I create a presence experience with him. I open up a conversation and I begin, looking him in the eye. I don't answer my texts. I'm blocking out the room and I'm very present with him. And I start to build connection. And then as soon as that's done, I close that. Then I go back to the tertiary and say, okay, what's the next plan here? And I use it in service of being present to the moment, because being present to the moment and connecting with people is the entire reason I'm there. It's not to get a job done.
I think that over the course of this podcast, when I go back and listen to our earlier podcasts, I can hear us being more in our 10-year-old or tertiary processes because we're trying to get a job done. You were trying to be, you were doing all the technical stuff in the back end. And so your extroverted thinking process was like hyped up. And my extroverted feeling process was all hyped up because I wanted people to like us and I wanted people to like me that were listening to the podcast. And I think as we got more developed, because you can almost kind of hear our development through the podcast over time, because you and I have both been very much focused on supercharging our Copilot processes. I think both of us have gotten so much more present on the podcast. We're so much more in flow. We're so much more honest. And I think, in some ways we've become less business-like and more personable.
Were you being dishonest before?
Yeah, no, I wasn't being dishonest. I was more in service of my tertiary or 10-year-old process wanting to be approved of. And now I have a lot less of that. And I think I've worked through the tertiary process of wanting to be approved of. Now I don't care if I'm approved of. Now I want to show compassion in service of my Copilot of introverted thinking. So I want to say things that I believe are truths to me, or the closest approximation to truth that I can get. Things that are truth, honest for me as an individual. And then I want to use extroverted feeling to create a compassionate container for those truths, as opposed to going straight to my 10-year-old and wanting to be approved of, and so saying things that sound smart in order to get that approval. That would be my Copilot of introverted thinking being in service of my 10-year-old of extroverted feeling. So you, as whatever your personality type is, yours is going to look different depending upon your type, but you're going to have very similar type dynamics going on. So if you feel like you have done a lot of work in your Copilot or auxiliary process, as Joel mentioned, it's going to look a certain way. And when you go to your 10-year-old or tertiaries to start developing that, one thing I want to mention is that it will sometimes feel like you're being regressive. It will sometimes feel like you're taking 2 steps back because you're starting all over again. You're mastering a new tool. But over time, what you'll find is that new tool is now in service to your strengths and it becomes super powerful. Just like Joel described, he's able to go to events and just be super present. He's able to show up as his honest, authentic self. He's able to have the impact on the people around him that he really actually wants because he's not just clocking it in. He's actually truly showing up and being present to the people that are there. So when you get to that point, you're developing your tertiary, it's going to feel a little clumsy, but the rewards are massive.
So we want to hear from you. Where are you in this journey? Have you put a lot of effort into your Copilot auxiliary process? Have you done a lot of development and you're like, man, I think I'm ready to go to my 10-year-old or tertiary and start developing that, utilizing that? Are you still in the development of your secondary or Copilot process? Let us know. We want to hear from you. It's important that your voice is heard. Come over to personalityhacker.com, leave a comment or ask a question below this show because your voice is important to us and we want you to be a part of this community. If you want to really tie into the community also, head over to facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack and be a part of a growing community of like minds, people very similar to you that are on a personal development growth path.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly giving, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. It helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We can't wait to talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.